Going into the penultimate round of the Batumi Chess Olympiad, Poland led the field by a point. They played against China, who suddenly seemed to have shot up the table from nowhere. And I want to show you the top board clash between Jan Krzysztof Duda from Poland, who thus far has been played extremely well, only 20 years old, and he faced the Chinese #1 player Ding Liren, 25 years old and on incredible form at the moment. Ding with the white pieces. And this was a very trendy opening. If you want to surprise someone, then this is worth looking out for. So in this position, black has many moves. You can play bishop e7, bishop b4, knight d7, c6, depends what your taste is, c5. Duda took on c4 and then e4. Now, the standard way to play this for black is bishop b4, and this leads to, well, very complicated lines that have been very well analysed after well, bishop c4 is an interesting pawn sacrifice for a start. That's possible, but you can also play bishop g5 as well. Those are the main moves. But instead, Duda played pawn to b5. And this move has really come to prominence over the last couple of years, almost from nowhere, actually. It's as though no one sort of thought to test this out. So what's the big idea? Well, first of all, if that pawn is taken, then knight takes pawn, and that should be fine for black. So instead, white plays e5. So the knight moves into the middle, and knight takes b5. I can imagine a lot of players in the past just assumed this was better for white, because black has these double pawns, material's even, particularly the pawn on c4 doesn't look very healthy. But knight b6 is the move. Just supporting the pawn. Actually, it's surprisingly difficult to win that pawn without some kind of disaster taking place. And the thing about maintaining that pawn on c4 is that it prevents white's bishop from moving to the dream diagonal here on d3. When you've got a pawn on e5, you really want to use that space on the king side, and that open diagonal is often your avenue to an attack on the king side. So instead, white has to compromise and play bishop e2. So black develops, and bishop e7. And now most players in this position have simply played bishop e3, developing. So let me just give you an example of this. A game between the Spanish player Anton and Del Rio de Angelis. And here you can see that black is hanging on to that pawn with the two knights. Very difficult to win that. And then takes the bishop onto the long diagonal, so that black can use the d5 square, and this bishop is a superb piece. And then the queen comes up, and queen c6. So obviously with the battery on the long diagonal, it's difficult for white to move the knight to do anything useful with that. The pawn is well protected. Now, white doesn't have a disadvantage here, but it's just very difficult to use the space created with e5 on the king side. This is the problem, and black is very solid indeed. But Ding played here a new move, and I think it's a move we're going to be seeing more of actually. He played queen d2. It's a clever idea. Now, he didn't think for very long about this, so he must have prepared this at home. Now, I don't have a record in my database of this move in this exact position, but, well, it's very sensible because it addresses the problems I've just been talking about, that white hasn't been able to get an attack going on the king side. But by playing this slightly ugly move in front of the bishop, the queen is going to transfer straight away to the king side. So let's have a look. Queen f4. Now Duda played rook b8. And then I drop back to c3. It's got to cut back at some point. And here, if black plays, let's say, a normal move with knight b4, then the queen is just going to shuffle across, threatening bishop h6 already, and probably king h8. But here white can get going with all the usual stuff. Perhaps h4, maybe bishop g5, maybe knight g5 and queen h5. And of course the second knight can also travel across to the king side. So, I mean, this is the ideal position for the queen in the danger zone. We've seen this in so many games from different openings with d4 and e4. For example, with the c3 Sicilian for white, where the pawn often comes to e5 and the queen transfers. Or indeed the French defence, where this is very important to have the queen on this side of the board. In fact, we've seen a game like this already from an advanced Caro-Kann variation earlier in the Olympiad. Batumi played it. So this is very normal to have the queen there. So let's just go back. So I should say knight b4 was not played. Instead, Duda took a belt and braces approach to the position. He thought, right, I'm not going to mess around here. There's a problem on the king side. I need to sort out that problem, f5, and block out the queen. Now, it's a really interesting move because white has a fundamental choice here. You can leave the pawn on f5, or you can exchange en passant. And this is a very tempting move because black's pawn structure is an utter mess. I mean, look at these 4 isolated pawns. And I think this is possible. Of course, the queen would like to stay active on the king side, but then it gets hit by the rook. I think this is the problem. So the queen would have to retreat to e3 or maybe d2. So white is losing some time here, and black has very active pieces. But you never know. If white finds a couple of accurate moves, then to control black's initiative, then he could stand well. So this is a tricky one. Instead of that, Ding just dropped the queen back to g3. So that means he doesn't have to worry about any attack on the f-file with a rook, for example. And the queen remains active. It's still, position's a bit closed now. But this pawn on e6 isn't very beautiful, although it's hard to get at it for the moment. So here black could play knight b4, queen e8. I mean, these are all possible. I don't think black has a bad position here. It's a tricky position. Instead, Duda decides to address the problem of bishop h6 and just pops the king in the corner. And then rook d1, protecting the pawn. Knight b4, well, looking at c2 and also perhaps here. And Ding's next move was very interesting. He played b3 to get rid of that pawn on c4. It's also possible to play, you could say, a more standard move with h4. But I guess he was worried that this could rebound, actually, that if a knight came in here and, you know, maybe even f4 at some moment, there could be a nasty counterattack, and then h4 could be weak. I think it's a very interesting move, b3. To get rid of that pawn, black has to take. Because it gives white a little bit more freedom, and of course opens the a-file for the rook. So Duda had to play the rather humiliating move a6 just to protect that pawn. It's a pity to have to waste that much time, but it doesn't make a huge difference. And bishop c4 from Ding, a very active move, preventing the bishop coming to b7, obviously because the e6 pawn is on prise, and well, black doesn't really want to exchange, giving white this huge center. And now knight c2 from Duda, and this is basically a tacit draw offer because the knight has to come back, and Ding repeated. And they repeated the position again, so Ding could have a draw if he wanted it. But instead, good man, he played on. Rook came into the centre, and it does look like a very nice position for the rook, actually. a5 from Duda, so now I think he's intending exchanging and playing bishop a6, and then white's pawns could be in trouble. So this was a do or die moment for Ding, and he'd obviously anticipated this, and he played d5 almost immediately, and this is where things get really wild. It's a pure pawn sacrifice, and black has quite a choice here. I mean, basically you can capture this pawn in 3 different ways. I'm kind of surprised that Duda didn't exchange off a couple of pieces, actually. He could have played like this. And I mean, obviously white has compensation here, and well, just h4 or something like that. I mean, all white's pieces look pretty good in this position, it has to be said, but it's highly unclear, and black is rather restricted. Well, he thought for 21 minutes over this move. He took with the pawn, so he had good reason, and indeed his position is not bad. e6 from Ding. So the point of this pawn sacrifice is to open more lines. So now you can see this diagonal opens, the e5 square is available, and that pawn on e6 really kind of cuts black's position in two. And here, well, my computer thinks that rook f6 is a good move. Well, quite possibly. I mean, white has compensation here. You can play bishop g5, or you can play bishop b5. Both moves are possible, and it's just a complete mess on the board. I mean, one thing is that from a practical point of view, you can see those rooks are split and white's forces are beautifully centralized. So just from that viewpoint, white has compensation. But after e6, bishop d6 was played. And bishop f4 gives compensation here, but queen h3 from Ding is a really, really tricky move. You can see, obviously, threats are starting to appear against h7. Knight g5 is in the air, for example. If pawn takes bishop, then knight g5 is actually winning. Threatening mate, and if h6 we go in, and that is winning for white because of the threat to give a check. And don't forget bishop takes h6 as well. It's interesting how that bishop hasn't moved but actually plays a very important part in this attack. So queen f6 played. That's very understandable. If your opponent's queen is in the zone, you want to bring your own queen over to match it. This is absolutely normal strategy. And now Ding absolutely goes for it. Knight b5. Well, maybe he had to by this point because the knight and the bishop were on prise. So he gives up that bishop and now takes on d6. Could be that knight g5 is stronger actually, but anyway, I'll leave that for you to discover yourself. There's certainly no win for white. Knight takes. Now, Duda recaptured on d6, which is a pretty natural move. In fact, he should have played bishop takes pawn. And although Black's position is incredibly loose. It seems like it's just about holding together. Incredibly. You know, with these weak points in the position and all white pieces in the attack, I can imagine that Ding just thought there must be something here. And there's reasonable compensation, but you know, after this there's really nothing clear actually. Or knight takes and bring the knight back with possible ideas of rook coming down. White has compensation, but black should be all right in this position, but it's fantastically complex. But here Duda made a mistake. He took that knight. Well, it's kind of understandable if you've got that beast kind of riding into the heart of your position. You want to get rid of it. But look what happens. E7. Attacking the rook, which moves to the side, and now a knight g5, threatening mate. So queen g6 defends, and now rook takes d6. I mean, I can only guess at what Duda overlooked here. Obviously, if that's taken, then there's a mate. So f4 from Duda, fascinating stuff. Threatening the queen, but Ding just advanced. And then the queen came down to b1. And now Ding played rook e1, which is a strong move, but I've got to show you another variation, which is just fantastic. So I repeat, rook e1 played in this position, a very natural move, breaking the pin on the first rank and also protecting the bishop. However, let me just show you queen takes f4, because this is really remarkable. Defending this bishop and threatening queen f8 mate. So far so good. Bishop d7. So what's the point of this? Well, now an incredible move, rook f6. Threatening rook down and mate. So this gets taken. Check, and another check, and the king goes in the corner. Now don't forget that that queen here guards the h7 pawn. But there is a beautiful win in this position. Rook c2. Now there are various lines here, but let me just point out why this wins. First of all, it blocks the queen. So queen h7 mate is threatened. And if queen takes rook, then there's no longer a pin on the first rank. We give a check. And the best that black can do is block for a moment, and then queen h7 mate. Now that would have been something. Let's go back. I mean, that's just extraordinary. I mean, rook c2 is just such a beautiful idea. In any case, rook e1 was played instead, which is a very strong move, very natural, very pragmatic. Also breaking the pin and just protecting the bishop. And now bishop f5 was played. I mean, bishop d7 is also possible here, but after this, the queen goes back. Queen h5, and here basically white's attack is just too strong. Rook h6 is coming, for example, and various other things too. Should be winning for white. In the game, bishop f5 was played. Rook d8, nice move. And if that's taken, then we give a check. And we take here, and that's just a bit too much. Oh, well, let's go to the end. Rook takes, queen takes, and now this one comes in. And the queen scuttles back to defend the bishop and to deliver mate round about here. Okay, back to the game. Rook d8 just played. Bishop g6. And queen f4. Threatening the rook also threatening mate. And now white wins in a kind of mechanical way because there's no defense to the advance of the pawn. And here, lots of ways to win, but bishop g5, well, forced a resignation. Here, Duda resigned. If rook takes queen up there, then rook takes queen down there. And white is a whole queen up, well, for a knight, but who's quibbling? What a sensational game by Ding Liren. He played with real courage. Didn't back down at any moment. If he had, then his attack would have just faltered. I think once you lose the initiative in these kind of positions, it is absolutely fatal. But if you keep the initiative, then you always have a chance. And Duda cracked in a very difficult situation. So that win helped China to a 3-1 victory over Poland. Poland have cracked right at the end. So USA beat Armenia, I should mention. So we have two teams going to the last round, two teams on 17 points. The USA played China, three teams on 16 points, France, Russia and Poland. So USA, China, France against Russia and India against Poland. It's going to be an absolutely cracking last round. Obviously, if either the USA or China win the match, they win the whole thing. If they only draw, then the other teams have a chance to catch up. And then it's all down to a very complicated tiebreak. At least I assume it's going to be as complicated as last time, which involves Sonneborn Berger and looking at the results of teams way down at the bottom of the table that they played, right at the start of the tournament. I hope it's less complicated than that. But anyway, find out tomorrow. Do check out the whole Olympiad playlist. You'll see the link up there. There's some great games. And watch out for my last round report tomorrow. Thanks for watching.